Canada's walking billboard, how Justin Trudeau sold himself to voters and the world. Also on today's program, Zimbabwe's cash crisis. As money dries up, people fear a return to $10 trillion notes and 500 billion% inflation. And in Picture This, is this the future of public transport? Hyperloop One makes the first move towards travel at the speed of sound. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Canada's new Prime Minister describes himself as a teacher, father, advocate and leader. Justin Trudeau claimed a shock election victory 6 months ago after a massive social media campaign. It was backed up by major policy shifts on issues ranging from Syrian refugees to the status of Indigenous people. But not just that. Trudeau has succeeded in crafting the image of a progressive, fundamentally different kind of leader. And with the help of a well-oiled publicity machine, he's selling himself and Canada to the rest of the world. Today's newsmaker then is Justin Trudeau, as we ask how long Trudeaumania will last.
He is, according to much of the world's press, charismatic, hip and handsome. A tattooed, sexy Canadian who isn't Justin Bieber, but is almost as popular.
On behalf of 35 million Canadians, we're back.
Justin Trudeau has pledged to change the way politics is done in Canada, and the world's media have focused as much on him as his policies. From posing with pandas to stripping for charity, this son of a former Prime Minister is used to being in the spotlight. But after 6 months in power, how much has been achieved? And will he keep to his Liberal agenda, including promising to legalise marijuana and electoral reform? Once in office, Justin Trudeau moved quickly to welcome Syrian refugees to Canada, a stark contrast to the reaction refugees received arriving in many other countries. The Canadian public embraced the plan.
Assalamualaikum. Welcome to Canada. Welcome to Canada. Welcome to Canada.
25,000 Syrians are being resettled in the country. Trudeau's seemingly more global outlook has brought more global attention. He's reset relations with his country's most important ally, which had been under strain, although there were tensions over Canadian jets being pulled out from the coalition fighting in Iraq and Syria. At the UN, Trudeau grabbed headlines by emphasising Canada's commitment to tackle climate change, promising billions to help other countries.
We have a role to play in supporting developing countries as well. They shouldn't be punished for a problem they didn't create, nor should they be deprived of the opportunities for clean growth that developing nations are pursuing.
At home, supporters welcomed the move away from right-wing Conservative politics and backed Trudeau's commitment to reaching out to different communities, including endorsing the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People. But plans for a new healthcare deal and a tax on carbon will face opposition. The decision to stimulate the economy by running a deficit has been criticised, and not blocking arms sales to Saudi Arabia was condemned by many. The massive wildfire that spread in the province of Alberta has recently been the focus of much of his attention. Also the fate of Canadian hostages being held by militants in the Philippines. Businessman John Ridsdale was recently beheaded.
Canada condemns without reservation the brutality of the hostage takers and this unnecessary death.
Trudeau's so-called honeymoon period seems to be continuing, although some criticise macho photo ops like this one for the Invictus Games.
Boom! Orlando, Invictus Games. Canada's ready.
A quantum state can be much more complex than that because, as we know,
the well-oiled PR machine is becoming more noticeable, such as this explanation on quantum physics. Critics say he should spend less time promoting himself and more on the affairs of state.
That's what's exciting about quantum computing, and that's what we're doing.
But the former amateur boxer is still fighting strong. Polls suggest under Trudeau, Canadians feel they live in a progressive and caring society. But some people's expectations have waned, and his next 6 months in power are likely to face greater scrutiny. Duncan Crawford, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now to discuss whether Trudeau can keep up the hype is Stockwell Day, a former leader of the Canadian Alliance. He joins me from Miami. And in Toronto is Haroon Siddiqui. He's a columnist at the Toronto Star. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Haroon Siddiqui, let me start with you. Trudeau's charismatic, he's charming, he's making an impact. Men tend to sway between admiration and, I guess, sometimes irritation when we look at him. Maybe it's just me. What's the secret to his success? Is this good public relations, or is there real substance behind this phenomenon?
Of course, there's great public relations. He's charismatic, he's young, he's strong. There's a generational change. He looks hip, he looks with it, and he looks off this century. But more than that, I think those kinds of things can last only so long. What has really been the different has been a transformational change in a whole list of policies. You know, while I was waiting for you, I drew up a list of changes that he has brought about. And there's 2 pages full of changes that have already been in solid policy matters. And there are some of the ones that you have mentioned on the international stage. Domestically, there's a long list of changes that he has already implemented and reversed the legacy of Mr. Harper. So there is great substance to what he is doing. We may agree or disagree with some of those things that he is doing. Stockwell will no doubt disagree with some of those things, as is right, and that is our system. But there's no question that he has transformed politics. It's like night and day between October last year and now.
Okay, it's like night and day, Stockwell Day. What do you think?
Well, it's beyond question that the charisma factor is there. The big question is going to be is, can the Prime Minister's surplus of charisma continue to cover up the deficit he is suffering in terms of decision making? And the real important matters of state are not being dealt with, and even some of his friends and supporters are saying that. You know, he came into the election process, he promised that there would be a small deficit, which was bold of him to do. But in fact, by the time the budget came out, the deficit is 3 times what he was projected to be, and no promise. He broke the promise of balancing that budget. On a number of these key economic issues and on trade and other issues, there is simply no decision-making in a profound way taking place. As a matter of fact, some of the media are starting to pull back a little bit from their honeymoon with Mr. Trudeau, in suggesting that they've never seen such a lengthy period of time in which cabinet ministers' offices cannot appear to even be staffed up so that the weightier matters of state, once you get beyond the selfies, can be dealt with. And this is starting to create some problems, certainly nationally and internationally, with some of our allies.
Yeah, Stockwell, let me just look at some of the stuff beyond the selfies. He's endorsed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. He's named the most diverse cabinet in Canada's history. Yes. In a short time, you would agree with this. He's made Canada a more respected, admired country. Now, especially amongst young people, I mean, we see every day, particularly on social media, many young Americans are asking, why isn't this guy running for president of our country in our 2016 election? Yes. Do you have a problem with any of that, Stockwell? Do you disagree with any of those achievements?
I think any elected person would love to have and be enjoying the sunshine in which he is now basking. And look, the Prime Minister is an engaging guy. I know him. I worked with him in the House of Commons, albeit on the opposite side of the room. But he's charismatic and he is young. And the interesting thing, he's got the same sort of youth appeal as Bernie Sanders has in the United States. They have tapped into something that may or may not have much substance to it, but there's no question that he has that kind of support. Even the polls show that he's still being supported. But when you look at the fact that the media now is only beginning to report, for instance, the deficit problems, the largest increase in spending in history in Canada in the last 45 years. And it's very interesting that the last time we saw such an increase in spending when there was no recession in place was when his father was Prime Minister in 1972. We have not seen such an increase in spending. So this is going to be the big question. Will
that's the only point you can.
Up to
that's the
We've got
Stockwell, you have said this only 3 times now. That's the only point you can make. The deficit is there because, in fact, the books were found to be far more in the red than was advertised. That's fine. You're absolutely right that the deficit that he's creating is far greater than what he had told the Canadian people, but he has leveled with Canadians.
Okay.
And the Canadian public is still with him on the bigger deficit.
Okay, then allow me to move this beyond the deficit and look internationally. Haroon,
Yes.
Prime Minister Trudeau is very proud to say very often, I'm a feminist, I'm a progressive, I stand for progressive values. He is not so progressive when he's selling armored vehicles to the Saudis worth more than $12 billion. That's not really in line with his human rights and feminist values, is it, Haroon?
No, the feminism that feminist point only goes so far. I mean, of course, he finds himself in a very awkward position, having been handed a deal by the former Conservative government of Mr. Stockwell Day's colleagues and so on. He could possibly have derailed it. But the argument that he is making, and I don't necessarily agree with him, is that how do you sort of go off and rip off an old contract, and what does it do to Canada's reputation in terms of doing business and so on? So we can have a good argument, and there is a good argument that why are we dealing with this regime in Saudi Arabia? The question I have is, why are we dealing with China? Why are we sort of falling over each other to make good relations with Myanmar, where there's ethnic cleansing of Rohingyas going on? So we can't have selective morality. You know, it begins to sound hypocritical. In isolation, the argument you make is absolutely valid. But just let's remember that this was the deal that was signed by the previous government.
Okay, I'm not being hypocritical by asking the question. I'm asking if he stands for these
values
so
I'm not saying
vociferously.
You are being hypocritical, but
sure.
this argument is hypocritical.
Okay.
Yes.
It's a hypocritical argument. So should we just leave him alone and accept his argument that he doesn't want Canada to look bad?
Let's have an adult conversation. You know, in the old days, John Diefenbaker, the Conservative Prime Minister, used to sell wheat to the Soviet Union, for example. We do great business with China. We do business with Myanmar. We do business with a lot of odious regimes. So what, in the totality of things, what should we do? Should we stop doing business and be good Canadians and say we will not deal with anyone who violates human rights? Maybe that is the route to go. But we need to be realistic and arrive at some judgment whereby it says, this is the argument for cancelling this contract, this is the argument for continuing to do deals with China, and have a level playing field where we can talk like adults and have some consistency in our argument. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, Stockwell Day, does that sound reasonable to you?
Yeah, I don't think the argument is hypocritical at all, but I will to some degree be agreeing with Haroon on some of these points. Every nation has to deal with other nations in spite of some of the shortfalls that those nations might be exhibiting. I will say Haroon stands to be corrected on a terrible factual error. In fact, one of the things that Mr. Trudeau was doing was trying to tell the Canadian public that there was a great deficit. And it was the parliamentary budget officer who said in January that, in fact, he was inheriting a $3.7 billion surplus. So many of the things that the Prime Minister has said are coming out simply as non-factual. This issue with Saudi Arabia is something that has to be dealt with, but that sale was constituted under the previous government also, wrestling with those same problems. But you want to talk about social issues, we had some of the key Aboriginal leaders in Canada today saying that there was no funding coming in for post-secondary education. In Canada, only 8% of our First Nations people have some kind of a degree status, and none of that money is coming forward. You mentioned, you talk about Saudi Arabia and bringing in the military in Syria. Here at the time of some of the greatest needs, Prime Minister decided to pull our jets out of Syria. All right, that's a decision made, but he's also deferred all the increase in military spending that was going to help on the equipment side. And we have a number of nations around the world looking at Canada saying the previous government was committing to the Trans-Pacific Partnership in terms of trade, and now Mr. Trudeau says he wants to study it again.
Okay,
I
let's
was
get
the one
Harun's
who,
response to
with
that.
the Prime Minister, had the honor, I had the honor of starting the process for the Canada-Europe Free Trade Agreement. And it was previously moving on well, and especially dealing with some of the areas in our farm sector, which were a great concern to the Europeans. And again, it is stalled. So we keep coming back to the question.
If you'll allow Harun to come in.
It goes beyond the monetary deficit, which is significant.
Okay, Harun, Stockwell Day's packed in a lot of stuff there.
No, nothing is perfect in life. I agree with Stockwell that on some of these issues, on the deficit and so on, as I've already said. But the more important point is all of those things, Stockwell, that you list, the great things that the previous Conservative government was doing, they were turfed out by the Canadian people. This guy continues to enjoy the honeymoon, and all of those issues that you have mentioned, one by one, they'll be tackled, and it is the job of Her Majesty's loyal opposition to criticize the government. And we'll see where the Canadian public falls and where the Prime Minister takes this country. But the argument originally was, how is he doing? He's done very well. He's done much better than many people thought he would, even substantially, not just on the basis of personality and charisma and boxing and dancing in the streets.
Stockwell, there was an article entitled...
Well, I've said from...
Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Respond. No, go for it.
Good.
Well, I've said on that point, in terms of the personality surplus and the charisma surplus, he's doing very well. But it's these other areas that the question is going to be, once the media has had enough of some of the superficial stuff, are they going to start to hold him to task? I mean, look at on the decision-making process, as I've already mentioned, one of the most important portfolios, of course, is the Ministry of Justice. And here the Justice Minister is still waiting for orders from the Prime Minister. There's 42 judge vacancies in the country to be appointed, and there's no process to move ahead with that.
Those judge vacancies were left by the previous government, Stockwell, don't forget.
I believe it is going to, I believe it's going to catch up to them. Now, there might have been vacancies there which were respected in the election process, but the election has been over for half a year.
There were lots of vacancies left by the previous government.
We have the risk now, the very real risk of serious cases being thrown out of court, and the media is starting to talk about this because of the inability of the Trudeau government to go ahead with some very basic decision-making. And this is where I believe our Prime Minister, along with his great qualities, he's got to realize that being head of state or being head of a government means you have to start making some tough decisions.
Okay, I got to come in there because we are out of time. Sure. Unfortunately, I've got to wrap, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us, Stockwell Day and Harun Siddiqui. Still to come on the Newsmakers, Zimbabwe prepares to print its own money again. And in picture this, the first public test of what could be the future of transport. Zimbabwe has almost run out of money. It has a $3 billion trade deficit, and it's set to print bond bills to ease the cash crisis. But for many Zimbabweans, it brings back bad memories of the last decade. Last time the government tried to print its way out of trouble, inflation ran to an estimated 500 billion%, wiping out savings and leading to severe shortages of goods. The Newsmakers Sandra Gathmann reports.
Zimbabwe's economy is in crisis. It's half the size it was a decade ago, and now cash is drying up. Banks are running out of money, triggering panic withdrawals. A raft of new plans have been drafted to contain the crisis, including a parallel currency. But it's all adding to concern that history may be about to repeat itself. Zimbabwe used to have its own currency, but the presses couldn't keep up with a runaway inflation rate that reached 500% in 2009 and led to this, the famous $100 trillion note worth about $300 at the time. The currency eventually collapsed, and Zimbabwe has since been circulating US dollars, South African rand, and even Chinese yuan. But cash is running out, A year ago, Zimbabweans were using candy as small change, prompting the Reserve Bank to issue so-called bond coins. Now the Reserve Bank announced it's preparing to print special bond notes pegged to the US dollar. Critics accuse the government of rigging the economy.
The majority of the people who have to go out and find their wares cannot use the bond. And it means that our people will become even poorer and poorer and poorer. There is no economy which is run on the basis of a paper which has no financial value.
Zimbabwe depends almost entirely on imports, an economic model that critics blame on President Mugabe's policy of seizing private farms and overspending. Zimbabwe still exports tobacco, but crops and sales have been crippled by months of drought. Dry weather has also fueled a malnutrition crisis unseen in over 15 years. The UN predicts more than 4 million people will need food aid next year. There's concern that Zimbabwe's cash crisis is fast becoming a humanitarian one. Sandra Gathmann, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Johannesburg to discuss Zimbabwe's cash flow crisis, we have the co-author of When Money Destroys Nations, Philip Haslam. Philip, good to talk to you. They call them bond notes, but I guess you believe this is essentially the Zimbabwean dollar that's back again, just dressed up as something else.
It's absolutely a mechanism for the Zimbabwe government to reissue its currency. It's currently using the United States dollars on the ground. These are actual notes that are being traded. The banking system there has a very low penetration, and so people actually have been trading in actual US dollar notes, which circulate tens of thousands of times. And these notes are dirty. Some of them are greasy and wet, and they're perishing. And the government's got the problem that the economy has got a constantly shrinking money supply in the economy, and this puts a lot of pressure on the banks and on people locally. There's a continual shortage of money. And so the government is in the process of trying to reissue its currency.
Now, you say that they are then set for hyperinflation again, and this is not a good idea. So why would they want to do this? Why would they want to tank their own economy? Maybe you're not giving them the opportunity they need to make it work.
Well, Imran, it's a good question. I mean, every government wants the ability to print money. You know, if a government has the ability to print money, they can print money and spend it on goods and services, and it's typically how the global banking system works in the United States, in Europe, in England, in almost every country around the world. This is how the system works, and you've got a scenario where the government on the one hand and banks on the other hand have a vested interest to be able to keep the money printing focused around themselves. So in Zimbabwe, they've not had the ability to print money. They're limited to the amount of tax revenue that they get in terms of what they can spend. And so the Zimbabwean government is significantly curtailed in what it can spend. So certainly if you were a member of Zimbabwe's population, you'd be majorly concerned. But as a government minister or someone in government, and in the banking system, you'd want the ability to print money.
Okay, Philip, good to talk to you. Philip Haslam joining us there from South Africa. In today's picture this, the Hyperloop One transport system has just completed its first successful round of testing in the Nevada desert. Let's take a look.
just about to see the beginning of a movement take hold that's going to change everything. It's going to change how we
Today's newsmaker was Justin Trudeau, as we asked whether Trudeaumania will last. The man has captured headlines around the world as a young, good-looking, progressive leader. And while that popularity lasts, it can only be good for Canada. But what happens when things go wrong? All leaders at some point have to make unpopular decisions. Trudeau has pledged to do a lot, but that will mean little unless he can back it up with action. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. We'll see you soon. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.